The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and ancient wood smoke. You roll out of your bed, a rustling straw-stuffed sack that mocks the very concept of comfort. And the first thought that claws its way through the morning haze is a tiny, treasonous spark of vanity. Maybe today, I'll try to look like less of a mud-stained disaster. You eye the single scrap of fine, brightly dyed wool you found traded at the market, a color a bit too rich, a texture a shade too smooth. You imagine yourself striding into the square, not as a peasant, but as an individual, carrying a tiny, fleeting piece of forgotten Roman elegance. Bad news. Congratulations, you've just committed a crime far more serious than petty theft. You've broken the sumptuary laws. In the Middle Ages, what you wore was never a matter of personal taste. It was state policy, a visual contract you signed the moment you were born. These laws didn't just suggest what you should wear. They dictated your life's palette. They were designed to ensure that you, a humble peasant, wore your class on your sleeve, literally. If you're a common laborer, you're stuck with wool. Scratchy, thick, and dyed a dull, earth brown or beige. It's a fabric so irritating it makes you question the very concept of a merciful God. The clothing is a uniform of perpetual toil, itchy enough to remind you constantly of your place. Meanwhile, the nobles, the dukes and barons, they practically swan around in fabrics so bright they look like they've been dipped in the blood of mythical creatures. They wear silk so fine it whispers when they move, and velvet so rich it seems to drink the light. Dare to imitate them, and the law won't just notice, it will crush you. The authorities had officers, the medieval equivalent of fashion police, who would roam the streets, their eyes sharp for an inappropriately luxurious trim or a prohibited shade. If they found you, the punishment was humiliation or worse. Imagine rotting in a cold, damp jail while rats chew the soles of your shoes, all because your tunic was dyed with a shade of green deemed too Dutchy for your station. It's not the glamorous rebellion you had in mind. The restrictions weren't vague. They were surgically precise. Purple was reserved for royalty, a color so deeply tied to imperial power it was off-limits even to most of the high nobility. Fur trims, like the immaculate white and black spots of ermine, were strictly forbidden unless your family possessed a title longer than your entire family tree. Even the most basic piece of clothing, your shoes, was regulated. The wealthy wore poulins, those ridiculous, pointed shoes that curled so far up they often had to be tied with fine chains to the knee. They were impractical, a sign that the wearer did not need to walk, let alone work. You, the dirt farmer, were expected to wear dull boots shaped like actual human feet. Functional, boring, and a constant, visual declaration of your earthbound status. The logic behind this seemingly nonsensical system was chillingly simple. The rich needed to remain visibly, undeniably rich. The entire fragile social hierarchy of lords, knights, clergy, and peasants rested upon clear visual cues. If a noble could be mistaken for a mere guy who shovels pig manure, the entire feudal system, based on absolute fealty, might collapse. The horror for the aristocracy wasn't the theft of property. It was the theft of dignity. There was, of course, a pragmatic economic angle, too. The nobles who controlled the land didn't want the peasants wasting what little money they earned on frivolous silk scarves when that money was needed for rent, taxes, and the occasional corvée labor demanded by the manor. Looking good was basically seen as a form of social and economic theft of the nobles' unique, inherited right to look fabulous. So, you reluctantly slip into your mandatory sackcloth chic, blending back into the gray-brown sea of the village, looking exactly as miserable and indistinguishable as the law intended. Because in the Middle Ages, your greatest crime wasn't heresy or even outright rebellion. It was daring to look or spend above your station while standing ankle-deep in mud. It was the crime of hope expressed through cloth. The long day of toil is finally finished. The sun has dipped below the ragged horizon, painting the clouds in shades of muted gold and smoke. You're sitting by the hearth, finally soaking in the one moment of profound, simple warmth you'll get all day. Perhaps a story is being told, or a worn tool is being mended by the last, flickering light. Then, suddenly, the town bell clangs. Not a pleasant chime, but a hard, insistent clang, clang, clang that slices through the evening air. It's not calling you to dinner. It's the medieval version of your overlord telling you to stop having fun and, frankly, stop being alive until morning. Is the curfew bell. The word curfew comes from the old French couvre-feu, which literally means cover your fire. At the sound of that iron voice, you are expected to do exactly that. Smother your hearth, snuff out your precious, expensive candles, and deliberately plunge your entire existence into darkness. This wasn't some draconian decree dreamed up by a board council. In its origin, the rule made perfect, terrifying sense. Your entire town, the walls, the roofs, the bedding, the market stalls, was constructed almost entirely of wood, wattle, straw, and pure, compressed flammability. One idiot leaving a candle burning in a gust of wind could turn the whole village into a smoking ruin before the midnight watch even changed. So, in theory, the rule was about communal survival, but the practice was a nightmare. Curfew means you are left stumbling around your one-room hut in a sudden, absolute darkness. You trip over the sleeping chickens, step into mysterious, cold puddles you desperately hope are just rainwater, and curse your inability to see your own hand. Forget reading, not that you can, and forget sewing or working late to earn a few extra coppers, unless you enjoy stabbing your hand with a needle in pitch blackness. Your nightlife, your personal, contemplative time, simply does not exist. Your day is brutally cut short by the whim of a bell tower. And of course, the wealthy didn't follow the same rules. The nobles inhabited fortresses of stone, with thick walls, high ceilings, and an army of servants to ensure no stray ember could threaten their comfort. Their fires burned all night. Their great halls were lit with dozens of costly tallow candles, allowing them to feast and plot and entertain long after the peasant class had been forcibly tucked into bed. But you're stuck with an enforced bedtime, courtesy of the bell tower's endless metallic judgment. If you're caught ignoring the sound, a flicker of candlelight escaping a shutter, the fine will often cost you more than a week's wages, a staggering penalty for simply trying to see. The curfew bell's purpose extended beyond just fire safety. It was an instrument of social control. The enforced darkness kept people indoors, which meant fewer drunks stumbling out of the alehouse to stab one another in the shadows, and fewer thieves lurking in the alleys. It was a clear declaration from the medieval government. We lack the police force to stop crime, but we can at least make sure you're all too scared and too blind to leave your homes after dark. So there you lie, rigid on your thin straw mattress, wide awake in the smothering blackness. You listen to the ceaseless, unnerving sounds of the night. Rats gnawing on the structural beams, the thin wooden walls transmitting the loud, unavoidable snores of your neighbor, the sound of your own anxious breathing. All because someone decided that the safest, most efficient way to run a town was to treat every resident like a 6-year-old at the mercy of a stern nursery monitor. When you blow out your last candle tonight, remember the rule exists not because you are irresponsible, but because the structure of your society is inherently fragile, and your only true freedom is during the bright hours of unrelenting labor. The darkness is owned by the men who ring the bell. You wake up hungry, a sensation less like a physical need and more like a permanent state of being. All morning, your mind has been running cinematic fantasies of food. The fatty, satisfying crackle of roasted pork, maybe a slab of beef, even just a smear of precious bacon grease. You walk into the tiny kitchen area of your communal hut, and reality smacks you in the face with a dull, saline stench of disappointment. It is Friday, which means no meat. Again, welcome to the medieval world of dietary law, a vast, relentless system of restrictions enforced not by the king, but by the church, the most powerful institution in your life. Nearly half the calendar year was off limits for meat consumption. Fridays, in remembrance of Christ's sacrifice, the 40 days of Lent before Easter, the 4 weeks of Advent before Christmas, and countless other fast days dedicated to saints and solemn occasions you've never even heard of. It all adds up to more fish than any landlocked peasant ever wanted to see. Forget the dream of bacon. It's salted herring again, or maybe a gray, pickled carp that tastes exactly like the mud it was pulled from. The spiritual message was clear: discipline, sacrifice, and a denial of carnal pleasure to purify the soul. But the practical message was even more urgent. Please stop eating all the cows before winter. This wasn't just arbitrary religious cruelty. It was a rough and ready form of food security. Cows were the very engine of the agricultural system. They pulled the plows, they provided milk, and their hides were essential for leather goods. If everyone slaughtered them at the first sign of hunger, the entire ability to farm the next year would collapse faster than your appetite at the sight of another pickled fish. These dietary rules stretched the fragile food supplies, provided a massive, government-backed boost to the vital fishing industry, and kept some semblance of order in a world perpetually one bad harvest away from a catastrophic famine. But that cold logic doesn't make the food any easier to swallow. Imagine trudging home after 12 hours in the frozen fields, your body screaming for fat and protein, only to be confronted by a plate of dried fish, its single glassy eye staring at you, as if it knows you're disappointed, as if it shares your misery. The rich, of course, had ways around this piety. They had access to luxury sea creatures like sturgeon and eels, where they commanded their cooks to create elaborate, almond-based fake meat dishes, using expensive spices and preparations to simulate the texture and richness of flesh without technically breaking the letter of the law. You, meanwhile, are left gnawing on a bony carp that tastes like the river bottom. People cheated. They had to. Hunger is the most persuasive advocate. Smugglers sold contraband meat on fasting days, and plenty of peasants quietly roasted a small chicken or a pigeon behind closed, smoke-filled doors. But if you were caught by a busybody neighbor or a zealous priest, the consequences were severe: heavy fines, public shaming, or long hours of humiliating penance, often requiring you to stand at the church door while everyone stared at you, as if you had personally doomed their immortal souls. The irony is that these constant, annoying dietary restrictions shaped the entire medieval economy. Coastal towns thrived on the demand for salted and preserved fish. Monasteries made fortunes running large-scale fish ponds. And the relentless demands of fasting days forced cooks to become incredibly creative with grains, vegetables, and legumes, slowly expanding the European palate. So, while you're chewing on your 47th plate of salted herring, a fish whose taste you now know intimately and despise utterly, just remember that you're not suffering for nothing. You are a small, miserable cog in the elaborate machine of medieval Europe's food security and spiritual control. Still, no rule in history has ever, or will ever, make fish taste like bacon. And that, truly, is the tragedy of Friday. Your stomach is a hollow, burning pit. Your family is thin, their faces drawn. The cabbage stew you've been eating for a week now tastes like a lukewarm distillation of sadness. Then you spot it, a plump, oblivious rabbit, hopping merrily through the edge of the woods, practically begging to be roasted over a slow fire. A vision of warm, savory meat fills your mind, and for a second, you feel a wild, desperate surge of hope. Perfect. Dinner is saved. Wrong. Catastrophically wrong. That rabbit belongs not to nature, and certainly not to you. It belongs to your Lord. Everything belongs to your Lord. The towering oaks, the swift-footed deer, the massive, aggressive boar, and yes, even that smug, pathetic little rabbit. Welcome to the medieval reality of forest and hunting law, where catching dinner without express, written permission from the nobility could make you a capital criminal. The forests were not public lands. They were the medieval version of a private, heavily guarded game reserve, and your local noble was not about to share the spoils of his territory with a hungry peasant. He didn't care that you were chewing on raw turnips like a desperate goat. He wanted venison, the flesh of deer, on his feast table, and you were most certainly not invited to partake. If you dared to snare that rabbit or set a trap for a pheasant, you were poaching, a crime taken with deadly seriousness, often deemed as offensive as murder or treason. The noble's logic was simple. To steal the king's or the Lord's deer was to disrespect their authority, their very ownership of the earth. Punishments were varied, but uniformly sickening. Best case, a fine so enormous you and your children would be indebted for life. Worst case, a hand chopped off, leaving you permanently crippled and unable to work. In the truly bad cases, the sentence was execution. Imagine being led to the gallows, your neck stretched by a rope, all for the medieval equivalent of stealing a chicken nugget. The sheer moral obscenity of risking your life for a bite of protein underscored the brutal inequality of the system. The nobility didn't just protect their food out of sheer greed. Hunting rights were a primal, public expression of power. To be able to ride into a vast forest with a pack of howling hounds and a retinue of men armed with crossbows wasn't just recreation. It was a literal, dramatic live-action flex of military and territorial dominance. They were practicing for war in the guise of sport. Meanwhile, you were supposed to clap politely as your betters slaughtered animals you weren't even permitted to touch, much less eat. Yet, peasants still poached. Hunger is a powerful, persuasive motivator, and rabbits breed faster than the Lord's justice could keep up. Whole villages sometimes banded together for secret hunts, slipping into the dark woods at night with nets, clubs, and homemade snares. The thrill was only partly about catching food. It was a profound, quiet moment of sticking it to the system, of reclaiming a tiny, perishable piece of dignity, if only for a single meal. But if you were caught, the Lord didn't see you as resourceful or desperate. He saw you as a thief daring to encroach upon his sacred authority. The ultimate irony remains. While you risked a gruesome death for a single, small rabbit, the nobles often killed animals in bulk purely for sport. Hundreds of deer and boar could be slaughtered in a single grand hunt, not because anyone needed that much meat, but because the sheer, wasteful spectacle looked impressive to their peers. So, you walk home empty-handed, stomach growling a soundtrack of defeat, dreaming of a roast rabbit you'll never taste. Because in medieval Europe, survival wasn't about skill, cunning, or even labor. It was about remembering that even the wildlife knew its place, and your lord's entitlement superseded your right to live. You've been accused. Maybe you stole that loaf of bread. Maybe you didn't. Perhaps your neighbor, whose field you accidentally trod upon, simply wanted revenge. Did you do it? In the Middle Ages, the truth wasn't decided by confusing evidence, contradictory witnesses, or clever lawyers. It was decided by God, and God, apparently, had a strange, almost sadistic sense of theater, one that often seemed to favor the physically imposing and the lucky. Welcome to the trial by ordeal, justice administered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, a process where your innocence was literally measured by your ability to survive medieval party tricks. The logic was simple, almost beautiful in its brutal simplicity. If you were truly innocent, God, in his infinite power, would intervene to protect you from harm. If you were guilty, he would let you burn, drown, or bleed. A seemingly fair system, until you realized that medieval Europe was a place full of genuinely innocent people with utterly terrible luck and absolutely no understanding of microbiology. Take the ordeal by hot iron or fire. The presiding judge, a local lord or a priest, would hand you a red-hot iron bar, perhaps weighing a few pounds, and solemnly command you to walk 3 paces with it clutched in your bare hand. You do it, your skin instantly sizzling and smoking like breakfast bacon. Then, they bandage your hand and tell you to wait 3 agonizing days. If, after those 3 days, the wound has begun to heal cleanly and nicely, congratulations. God protected you, and you are innocent. If, however, it festers, swells, and becomes violently infected, which in a world without soap, antibiotics, or clean bandages, it absolutely, predictably will, then you are guilty. Enjoy your punishment. Or maybe you face the ordeal by cold water. They tie you up, often binding your right hand to your left foot and vice versa, mutter a prayer, and toss you into the nearest pond, river, or specially blessed pool. The logic here was based on a deeply flawed spiritual belief that pure, consecrated water would reject the liar, the guilty. Sink, and you are innocent, though you might now be dead at the bottom of the river. Float, and you are clearly guilty, proving that the water has rejected your foul, lying body. And then there was the ordeal by combat. Someone accuses you of a crime, and instead of hiring lawyers, you both grab swords, shields, or great wooden staves and fight it out. The belief was that God would naturally grant strength and victory to the righteous party, which sounds high-minded and noble until you realize the other guy is 6'5", a professional soldier who has been training with a sword since he could walk, while you have spent your life stooped over a plow, harvesting potatoes. Guess who God favored that morning? Justice wasn't about righteousness. It was about muscle mass, training, and the thickness of your callous skin. To be fair, these public trials weren't always taken entirely literally. There are records of cunning priests who would use slightly less than boiling water or claim to interpret a marginally healthy hand to avoid killing too many people, especially those who were clearly well-liked or useful to the community. Eventually, the church, which had previously sanctioned the entire system, realized that the formula burn this guy's hand and see what happens wasn't the most reliable or sustainable form of legal system. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, the practice was officially banned. But for centuries before that, trials by ordeal were the terrifying gold standard of justice. Which means that if you lived in that era, your innocence was not proven by your honesty, your character, or the facts of the case. It was proven by whether or not your fragile body could survive a dangerous, high-stakes medieval party trick involving fire, water, and blunt force trauma. Next time you complain about sitting through jury duty, remember at least no one is asking you to grab a searing hot iron bar and desperately hope for divine skincare. It's Sunday morning. You'd love nothing more than to sleep in, to let the exhaustion of the week steep out of your aching limbs. But the church bells are already ringing, a cacophony that sounds less like an invitation to worship and more like someone mercilessly hitting a cow with a heavy frying pan. You drag yourself out of your pile of straw, a sense of weary resignation settling over you. You go to Mass because if you don't, you risk heavy fines, public penance, or worst of all, public gossip, which in a tight-knit medieval village is a social plague that spreads faster than the Black Death itself. Here is the monumental, contradictory catch. After the long, often incomprehensible Latin sermon, you are strictly not allowed to work. No plowing the fields, no weaving cloth, no fixing the gaping hole in the roof that is currently dripping rainwater into your morning porridge. The rule is simple, non-negotiable, and enforced by the highest power in the land. Sunday is the Sabbath, God's day, not yours. You are commanded to rest, reflect, and avoid sin, particularly the sin of greed, which work on the Sabbath was thought to represent. This sounds lovely in theory, a mandatory day off, until you remember that your landlord does not care about your spiritual reflection. He still wants his rent money. And the weeds in your field, the rain seeping through your roof, and the animals needing to be tended did not get the Sabbath memo. Every moment of forced rest is a moment you fall further behind. Yet, the church, to its credit, enforced this for reasons that were as pragmatic as they were pious. A mandated weekly rest day was essential to keep the peasant class from literally working themselves into an early grave. In a world with no concept of paid vacation, no weekends, and where a man's life expectancy was measured by his ability to endure nonstop manual labor, Sunday was the one. Ironclad day, you could avoid dropping dead in the field. Call it medieval HR policy, ingeniously wrapped in scripture and divine command. Of course, rest was a relative term. You weren't exactly reclining with a carafe of fine wine and some soft cheese. You were sitting through a 2-hour Latin sermon, delivered by a priest speaking a language you mostly didn't understand, followed by seemingly endless prayers and hymns. After that, you might try to sneak in a nap, only to be reminded by the omnipresent church rhetoric that idleness was also a sin. In short, Sunday gave you the choice of being bored into holiness or guilty of laziness. Naturally, exceptions existed for the privileged. Nobles still rode out to hunt, servants still cooked and cleaned for them, and emergencies like putting out a fire or assisting a difficult birth didn't count as work. But if you try to sneak in a little extra farming or finish a small piece of weaving, your neighbor, the very one who spent the whole sermon staring intently at you, would rat you out. Suddenly, you're standing barefoot and shamed at the church door while the priest chastises you in front of the entire village, making a public example of your desire to put temporal needs above spiritual ones. Still, the rule had powerful staying power. Without it, the lords and landowners would have likely worked the peasants 7 days a week until they physically collapsed. The Sabbath gave you at least the illusion of rest, a small, 7-day buffer between endless, mind-numbing toil and inevitable death. So, you trudge home from the long mass, eat your cold, dark porridge, and rest by staring at the wall, hoping your mind can quiet itself before the Monday bells ring. Congratulations! You have survived another Sunday without accidentally sinning. Sort of. You've decided you're tired. Tired of farming the unforgiving mud. Tired of the taste of sadness-infused cabbage soup. Tired of being dependent on the whims of a landowning lord. You want to try your hand at a trade. Something clean, something with skill. Maybe you'll become a baker, a blacksmith, a goldsmith, or even a specialized weaver. Great idea, except you can't just start hammering metal or selling loaves of bread. First, you need the explicit blessing and acceptance of the medieval equivalent of a fiercely protective, exclusive, and occasionally ruthless club, the Guild. Guilds were the supreme controllers of commerce and craft in the medieval town. Want to bake bread? You must be in the Baker's Guild. Want to shoe horses? The Farrier's Guild. Want to carve wooden spoons, dye cloth, or practice medicine? Believe it or not, there is almost certainly a guild for that, too, watching your every move. If you try to work outside the guild system, they would fine you, drive you out of the marketplace, seize your goods, or, on a bad day, send a couple of armed enforcers to ensure you remember the rules by smashing your equipment. Joining the club was neither quick nor easy. It was a decades-long, grueling process designed to filter out the uncommitted and the unskilled. First, you had to spend years as an apprentice, living in a master's house, basically working for free or only for room and board, in exchange for learning the secrets of the craft. Your labor was cheap, and your master's authority was absolute. After that, you'd graduate to journeyman, a day worker. You would wander from town to town, working for wages, trying to perfect your craft while still adhering to the vast network of guild rules. This stage could last a decade or more. Only after this long, probationary period could you apply to become a master yourself. This required producing a masterpiece, literally a perfect, exquisite example of your craft that was a testament to your skill and dedication. And who judged your masterpiece? The existing masters in the guild. These were the very men who had every reason to make the standards impossibly high, ensuring fewer people could join their elite, money-making club and dilute the market share. It sounds less like a vocational school and more like a restrictive, self-serving cartel. At first glance, this system feels suffocating, a true enemy of entrepreneurial freedom. But there were compelling, practical reasons for its existence. Guilds set and enforced strict quality standards. People didn't die from bread made with sawdust, and the armorer's product wouldn't shatter on the first swing in battle. They also regulated prices, wages, and working hours, which prevented chaotic, ruinous competition. Most importantly, they protected their members from foreign competitors and non-guild interlopers. A guaranteed customer base and a secure way of life, provided you were inside the club. For you, the non-member, the downside was lethal. Without guild membership, you couldn't legally sell your work, and your attempts to make an independent living would be violently curtailed. You'd end up like the fool who tried to open a discount bakery and had his freshly built oven smashed to pieces by guild enforcers. Medieval Yelp reviews weren't written with words. They were written with bricks through your window. So you swallow your pride, sign on as an apprentice, and sweep the shop floor for 7 long, exhausting years, hoping that one day your masterpiece, a single, perfect object, doesn't get rejected on a technicality. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't just follow your passion. You had to follow the guild, or else your dream of a better life would be swiftly and brutally extinguished. You don't own a clock. You have no way to measure an hour, a minute, or even a consistent half day. Time, for you, is not a concept of fixed linear mathematics. It is entirely whatever the local church bell says it is. And those bells, those eternal metallic tyrants, they never, ever stop. They ring to wake you up before dawn. They ring to drag you to morning prayers, prime. They ring for your first meager meal, terse. They ring for the cessation of work, vespers. They ring for your enforced bedtime, curfew. The bell tower is essentially your overbearing, nonstop public parent, and you have no way to slam the bedroom door and escape its relentless demands. Your life is not self-directed. It is a schedule etched in sound. Picture the scene. You're out in the muddy fields, finally making perfect rhythmic progress with the plow, finally finding a physical rhythm that brings a measure of peace. Then clang, clang, clang. It is the nun bell, the mid-afternoon prayer hour. You must stop, fall to your knees in the dirt, and mutter a few words to a God who, at this moment, feels very far away. You go back to work, finally finding your pace again, and clang, clang, clang. The Vespers bell signals the end of the working day, a full hour before true dusk. Off you go again, abandoning your task mid-furrow. The bells weren't just about controlling your spiritual life. They were the absolute center of civic control. They announced the opening and closing of the market. They enforced the curfew. They were the earliest form of mass emergency communication. Fire in the town? Bells. Enemy attack approaching the walls? Bells. Somebody important died? Bells. They were the medieval version of push notifications. Constant, impossibly loud, and physically impossible to turn off. The most insidious part of this system was the utter lack of individual autonomy. The priest, the abbot, or the town officials decided when the bells rang, and you obeyed immediately. It did not matter if you were in the middle of a crucial task, a moment of intimacy, or a deep thought. The bell owned your moment. Oversleep the morning bell? Everyone knows, and you face the gossip and judgment. Leave work early? Everyone knows, because the final bell hasn't rung yet. Forget to show up to Mass? The bells are the ultimate tattletale. In theory, the bells provided a vital, necessary order in a world without common literacy or watches. Most people couldn't read a calendar, let alone keep track of specific fractional hours. The constant, predictable sound of the bells structured the chaos of rural life and provided a shared, public definition of the day. But for you, the common person, it meant your life was less a freely lived existence and more a pre-programmed cycle, an eternal, inescapable call and response, making you Pavlov's dog centuries before Pavlov. The sound structured the town, but it shackled the individual. So you trudge on, ears ringing, your entire existence carved into bell-shaped chunks of time. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't ask what time it was. You simply waited for the bells to tell you who you were, where you should be, and exactly how little control you actually had over your own short, loud life. You cough, just once a dry, small sound deep in your chest, in the middle of the crowded marketplace. Bad move. Suddenly, the noise of the market dies, and every single set of eyes snaps onto you, wide with a terror so palpable it makes the hair stand up on your arms. It's an instant of absolute silence, as if you've just confessed to the crime of witchcraft. Welcome to plague season, where a single sneeze doesn't just spread a cold. It can get your entire neighborhood forcibly shut down. In the Middle Ages, quarantine was not optional, and it was enforced with brutal life-or-death logic. If someone in your house got sick, a rash, a fever, the telltale black buboes, the town authorities would instantly spring into action. They would happily lock your door from the outside, nail it shut with heavy planks, and then paint or nail a large, frightening red cross onto the wood. The whole town knew you were now a sealed, walking biohazard. You and your family did not leave that house until every single person inside was either fully cured or safely buried. Forget fresh air, forget outside help. The brutal calculus was clear. Better one dead, sealed family than a dead, contaminated village. The entire structure of daily life collapsed. Markets closed. Inns barred their doors. Weddings, fairs, festivals, everything that made life minimally bearable was outlawed. The logic was tragically sound. Keep people apart, and maybe, just maybe, they would stop spreading death like it was free samples at a festival. But for you, the trapped victim, it meant isolation, starvation, and the horrifying claustrophobia of endless, close-quarters conversations with your frightened family in one cramped, sealed room, all of you waiting to see who would start coughing next. And if you were among the desperately poor souls working as a gravedigger, things were even worse. The authorities treated you like a condemned man, forcing you to work day and night, hauling the corpse carts, digging vast trenches, and trying not to catch the very thing you were burying. Refuse, and you would be punished like a criminal, fined, jailed, or exiled. Accept, and you'd probably die anyway. Career options in the plague years were bleak indeed. Travel bans were equally absolute. Whole towns locked their heavy gates to outsiders, and strangers were treated with a suspicion that bordered on outright violence. Merchants were turned away, and if you did manage to sneak in, the hospitality you received would likely involve pitchforks and quarantine sheds. The laws were desperate, and sometimes there were moments of medieval brilliance. Some Italian cities did successfully reduce death tolls by enforcing incredibly strict quarantine measures. Others simply panicked, shut everything down, and hoped God would notice their obedience. The result for you was the same. Trapped at home, rationing stale bread, and hoping the wheezing cough from your neighbor's sealed house didn't drift through the thin wooden walls. So, you sit in your sealed-off, hot house, staring at your family, the red cross on the door a blazing symbol of your doomed status. The only possible upside? For once, you don't have to go to church. But it's hard to feel saved when the priest is outside, marking your door like it's the medieval version of a permanent hazard sticker. Breaking quarantine didn't just mean risking your own life. It meant risking the entire village. And the entire village was highly motivated to make sure you stayed permanently inside if necessary. You stink. Everyone stinks. It is the Middle Ages, after all, a symphony of sweat, smoke, livestock, and unwashed wool. So, when you finally manage to scrape together enough meager coins to visit the local bathhouse, a rare treat, you think maybe, just maybe, I'll leave here smelling less like a damp goat and more like a human being. You walk up to the familiar, steam-stained door, ready to scrub weeks of accumulated filth off your skin, and find the entrance barred, a heavy chain, and a stern notice posted. Why? Because the town authorities have decided, once again, that bathhouses are basically plague factories. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. The medieval bathhouse, stew, or stufa, was far more than just a place for washing. It was a communal social club, a place for boisterous gossip, a site of relaxation, and let's be honest, a budget brothel where discreet transactions were commonplace. It was a place where you could chat, soak away your aches, and catch a social disease or a stomach bug all in one conveniently warm visit. When the terrifying waves of plague, and later, the emergence of syphilis, swept through Europe, the public bathhouse became everyone's favorite, easy scapegoat. The logic was intuitive. Shut down the places where people congregate and exchange fluids, and maybe people will stop dropping like flies. Or maybe they just keep stinking, which is at least less contagious than the Yersinia pestis bacterium. But the periodic bans and moral panic created a profound problem. Without the public bath, your hygiene options were almost non-existent. Washing at home meant the back-breaking labor of hauling buckets of freezing water from the well, dumping them into a small wooden tub, and trying to pretend this miserable, quick splash counts as a spa day. Soap was a costly, precious luxury. Hot water required precious firewood, and honestly, your family would rather use that wood to cook the paltry dinner than to ensure you don't smell like despair. The nobility, in their fortified homes, played by completely different rules. They had private, enclosed bathing rooms, perfumed oils imported from the Orient, and a staff of servants to scrub them down. You, the commoner, are left rubbing yourself with a rough rag, hoping no one notices that your natural musk is now strong enough to reliably scare away the village dogs. And the church often viewed public bathing with deep suspicion independent of plague. It was too much nudity, too much easy mingling of the sexes, and worst of all, too much fun. If you enjoyed it, it was probably sinful. Thus, the bathhouses lived in a moral gray zone, tolerated one year as a necessity for urban health, and banned the next as a sinkhole of sin and disease. You never knew if your evening soak would leave you refreshed or lead to your excommunication. So you shuffle back home. Dirt is still caked under your fingernails, your hair is greasy, your skin is a map of various itches. You tell yourself bathing is overrated, that nobody notices the smell anyway. Except they do. They all do. Everyone in your village shares the same distinct, multi-layered aroma. A dark blend of sweat, wood smoke, livestock, and a heavy, metallic tang of constant, grinding failure. Because in the Middle Ages, washing yourself wasn't just about hygiene. It was about politics, morality, public health, and a continuous battle against the forces of decay, both physical and moral. You finally die. Congrats. The endless toil is over. The perpetual hunger silenced. The fear of the bells and the plague ended. You'd think that with the finality of death, the oppressive weight of medieval law would finally lift. You'd think burial would be simple. Dig a hole, drop you in, say a prayer, done. But no, this is the Middle Ages, and even in death, the relentless rules still have you by the throat. Your final resting place depends far less on the purity of your soul and far more on the thickness of your coin purse. The first, immediate problem is consecrated ground. If you want to be buried in the sacred churchyard, under the spiritual protection of the church, you need money, a great deal of it. There are fees for a proper grave, fees for the officiating priest, fees for candles, and fees for ringing the bells one last, mournful time. If your family cannot pay these required funerary costs, your body will be unceremoniously shoved into a mass, unmarked grave, often located outside the town walls with a nice, scenic view of the local garbage heap and the latrines. Hope you like the smell of rotting cabbage and human waste, because you'll be sharing eternity with it. The second problem is space. Churchyards and town cemeteries filled up incredibly fast. When they ran out of room, the grave diggers, with no room to expand real estate, didn't hesitate. After a few years, once the flesh had completely decomposed, they would dig you up, toss your bones, your final, intimate remains, into a communal charnel pit or a stacked bone house, and recycle your coveted plot for the next paying customer. Yes, even in death, you could be evicted. Nothing says rest in peace like being stacked like firewood in a dark corner, your skull looking out at the marble effigies of the wealthy. The final insult came from the rules about how you died. If you committed suicide, you were denied consecrated ground entirely and were often buried at a lonely crossroads, with a stake driven through your heart, an attempt to pin your restless, damned soul to the earth so it wouldn't bother decent people. If you were executed for a crime, your corpse might hang on display for days as a warning, or be quickly dumped in a ditch. Die of the plague? Straight into the nearest trench, a layer of quicklime sprinkled on top, with no ceremony, no dignity, and no trace of who you once were. And the church, for all its talk of charity, was not always sympathetic. If you had died excommunicated, they wouldn't even let your body near holy ground, refusing the final rites. Basically, sorry, eternal damnation wasn't quite enough. Now you're banned from the graveyard, too. The wealthy, predictably, had a completely different death. Nobles secured massive, permanent tombs, complete with carved effigies and coat of arms, often securing a prime spot inside the church itself, where their stone likeness could glare down at the generations of living peasants for centuries. You are lucky if your grave marker isn't just a moss-covered rock with "Here lies nobody important" implicitly scratched on it. So, even in your final moments, you realize the Middle Ages never stopped reminding you of your place. The rules didn't just tell you how to live, how to dress, or how to work. They told you how to rot, and where you belonged in the eternal hierarchy. The ultimate, final joke is that your descendants will probably forget where your unmarked, recycled plot even was. Because in medieval Europe, even the afterlife had a waiting list and your social standing dictated your proximity to God.